Hi, it's Pete, Mindwise Man's channel, aka Maverick Outdoors, and also Maverick Meals to the Max. And as you can see so far, I've foraged some dandelions from my own private garden, and I'm going to use the leaves, the petals, and unflowered buds. So those three parts of the dandelion to actually make the mainstay of the actual soup. I separated the petals from the green outer case of the bud because it gives it more texture and tends to thicken up the soup if you actually have the petals. You can use the whole flower if you want to, but it depends on the sort of texture. Because I'm going to be adding onions and potato and also some garlic, that will actually give it a different texture. So I really want the dandelions to actually make the sort of thickening of the soup. So as you could see, I discarded the petals to use in the ingredients, and I'm going to not include the outer casing of the flower bud, but it is personal choice. You can do and have those two extra ingredients or the whole of the dandelion head flower, but it's down to personal choice. But in this recipe I'm just going to discard the outer casing and use just the petals of the flower head. So now I'll take you into the Maverick kitchen and we'll go on to the next stage. Ready to chop those leaves. So the simplicity of doing it indoors, it just makes it easier to actually show, albeit you can actually prep this outdoors and have this as a survival food with just basically these three parts of the dandelion. But that will make more sense when you actually see me add the other ingredients, which is going to make up more of a sort of a domestic recipe, albeit you could just use the dandelion just on its own. But now, as you can see, I've sort of aligned the leaves so they're just nice and tidy, make them easier to cut and do in 1-inch sections. So now the dandelions are prepped, about equal quantities of each, the petals, the leaves, and of course the buds. With the petals, you saw that I actually rinsed them. It isn't necessary if you don't want to, but if you are a bit concerned, you just want to get any sort of grubs off or any insects, but you don't want to rinse them for too long, otherwise it can take away some of the flavour and the fragrance. So I just sort of did it very mildly, rinsed them out, just did it twice, and just from the aroma you know that the flavour's still going to be in them. But if you're using this as a survival food and foraging it outdoors, prepping and eating it outdoors, then basically all the ingredients you just want to sort of shake it off or wipe them off with even a piece of tissue or a piece of cloth or even a bit of clothing, and you might be glad of the protein if there's any insects in your ingredients. For convenience, I've got the added vegetables ready on a separate chopping board. As you can see to the left, sweet potatoes, and then ordinary potatoes, organic and organic onions. So it sort of complements the fact that this is all fresh, naturally from the wild. And then these ingredients you can see here, I'm going to make it nice and garlicky. But I don't want to talk about weights and, you know, what weight of potatoes or what weight of vegetables that you add with the dandelions. Basically, if you think of sort of equal quantities, I spoke about the equal quantities of the leaves, the petals and the buds. But what I've actually done with the added vegetables, I've sort of doubled the portion of the potatoes and near enough just over nearly double portioned what would be volume of the onions. So I've sort of like doubled the volume of the added vegetables compared to the smaller volume of the dandelion. So I hope that makes sense, but it's not important to have to think of what weight of vegetables. It's more of the volume and the space and the size and the amount you're actually going to make. So now I've chopped the base ingredients, potatoes, sweet potato and onion. You can see it's sort of much more of a volume there, which will give more substance to the soup and the texture. But that's the base ingredients to add to the dandelions. So here's the seasoning. So as you can see there, the garlic, I use the garlic press, which actually makes it much more sort of a smaller type of texture, which then tends to get more of a flavour into the soup. Here I've got a teaspoon of turmeric, there a teaspoon of, or just under a teaspoon of paprika, They're half a teaspoon of cinnamon, half a teaspoon of ground nutmeg, less than half a teaspoon of tarragon, which actually complements, it's more of a sort of a tangy vegetable sort of herby flavour than the actual dandelions, so it actually does complement the flavour of the dandelions. And then here, just over about a flat teaspoon of ground black pepper. So obviously any of the seasoning that you want to add, I will actually add some salt as well, some ground sea salt, but all the seasoning is really down to personal taste. But if you bombard it like with a turmeric, I know from my taste buds and making the soup before with the dandelions, that this amount of seasoning ingredients is just enough not to actually blind the flavour, if that makes sense, of the actual dandelions themselves. I mean, the dandelions are fine on their own, but it tends to be a bit of a sort of a plain vegetable. It's a bit like if you were just to have carrot soup or cabbage soup, but you add things to it, like the vegetables of your choice, which aren't too strong in flavour, again, not to actually mask the flavour of the dandelion, so everything blends together. But just back to the chopped onions, I've finely chopped the onions because they tend to get the flavour into the soup compared to sort of chunks or slices. So that's what I wanted with the onions, hence chopping them up really fine so it blends into the whole texture and flavours the soup much more strongly with the onions. First thing I'm going to do in the process of cooking is melt a big knob of butter there, and also near enough about the same quantity and volume of virgin olive oil, and then I'm going to add the onions and the leaves and just sort of soften them. By browning and softening the onions and the leaves and not just boiling up everything together, by just doing the onions and leaves separately, it sort of cooks them with a different flavour compared to just adding them raw straight into boiled water. Plus as well, the olive oil and the butter adds to the texture and flavour as well, and then just cooks the onions and leaves through quite nicely. So it does actually change the flavour a little bit. Obviously if you're indoors it's much easier to actually do that, but if you're outdoors and you want to add whatever other ingredients to your foraged dandelions, then you just cook it all in one hit, because obviously that's more convenient. So now the chopped onions are added to the butter and the virgin olive oil. I'll just let these start to cook through first, just very gently simmering and just browning through, sort of sautéing them in a way, and then I'll add the leaves, because obviously the leaves are a softer texture and I don't want them to totally shrivel up before the onions have gone through the cooking process to sort of have that flavour that I was just explaining. So I've had them on the simmer now for about 6-7 minutes, and even the smell from like the fresh sharp onion has now sort of become sweeter, more of a sweeter oniony smell, so you know that's the sort of flavour that's starting to get extracted out of the onions that's actually going to add into the soup. So also you want to go on the aroma as well. As it gets sweeter, you know that's the sort of desired flavour, well for my taste buds anyway. So as you can see, I've now added the dandelion leaves. And if you are a bit concerned, if the leaves tend to be a little bit older or larger and you feel the taste of the leaves is going to be a bit bitter, then you can always blanch them before doing what I've actually done here, is actually to just boil up some water, just simmer them for about a minute or two, and that will get rid of some of the sort of sharp flavour. But here I knew that these leaves were quite young, medium sized, so I just wanted to put them straight in with the onions and add that flavour to it, because I knew they weren't going to be too bitter. But again, it's down to, if you've got a bitter taste bud and you like that, then obviously don't blanch them. And now I've added all the seasoning, the spices, the garlic, and I'm actually going to sort of cook it through with the onions and the leaves, because it tends to sort of bring out the flavour more than just adding it to boiling water once the vegetables go in. So as with like things in when you make curries or spicy food, initially adding the spices, it sort of cooks the flavour into the initial ingredients before you then start making it saucy or adding sort of like liquid to it. So that's why I've done it now, because I know it's going to bring the flavours out much stronger. And I can smell that already, like I said before. Scratch and sniff scream, people. The aroma, awesomeness in a saucepan. I boiled up 1.5 litres of water in the kettle just for convenience, and then put it in here and mixed 2 vegetable stock cubes, and then poured that, as you can see, into the saucepan, into the previously prepped ingredients. And now I'm going to add the vegetables to it and bring it to a boil, then simmer. So now everything is in the saucepan, all the veg, all the dandelions, everything I've prepped. It's now ready to bring that to a boil and then simmer it about 35-40 minutes on a nice basic simmer. Softens everything, brings out the flavours, but doesn't turn it into a mush by cooking it for too long. What I've done, I've moved it onto a smaller gas ring so the heat is more central, and as you can see it's just simmering away with the odd stir here and there to distribute the heat evenly through the cooking process. So that's been going for nearly 40 minutes now, sort of half hour to 40 minutes, that's a normal time span, but you can always do the fork test. You can see the potatoes not getting too mushy but just soft, so I know that that's cooked through. So I'm going to turn the heat off now and just leave that to stand, cool down a bit, and then eventually put 2 portions at least in one each of these microwavable containers that I've recycled. I've had these for quite a while. They're sort of a particular microwavable meal comes in them, but they're really handy to contain sort of home prepped food. Put them in the freezer or store in the fridge. And considering that was about 1.5 litres of water, and then to sort of make the stock, and then with the added vegetables and all the other ingredients, it bulks it out to make that near enough just over 2 litres in volume of actual soup. So you've got a good few portions there. So those 2 containers, each of them will take about just over half a litre. So that's 2 good portions, which I think I'll put in the freezer. Once it cools down, then put the soup in the container, or when it cools down and it's just a bit warm, put it in here and then wait till it gets totally cold, put the lid on and then put it in the freezer. And whatever's left in the saucepan, there's going to be enough for me to have a large portion as a main meal tonight with some crusty bread or garlic toast, and then the rest that's left over in the saucepan I can maybe have it as a smaller portion to put in another container and put it in the fridge. So, dandelion homemade soup, scoff to the max, food for free, of course except for the veg you've gone out and bought. But if it's a survival food, then of course it's not going to cost you anything except for knowing what you're looking for and then cooking it up. So all good stuff. So that was Maverick indoors, Maverick meals to the max, indoors domestic, doing the homemade soup. Mainly because if I didn't get a chance to do it actually outdoors, and the chance of foraging dandelions sort of later on, sort of maybe in the next month or so when I'm able to get out and do some wild camping and cooking outdoors, I might not have been able to actually include the process of how you can make homemade dandelion soup. So I thought, well, today domesticated, can't get out, so I thought what I'd do is just show you the example of there's many different flavours that you can add, but obviously it's down to personal taste buds really. You can add many different other types of vegetables, but it's not wanting to actually blind the flavour of the actual dandelions. The strongest flavour of the dandelion is actually the leaves, which have got, I suppose if you think about it, it's a cross between sort of cabbage, rocket and spinach really all mixed into one. So it's quite a sort of, got quite a sharp flavour to it, hence adding some of the seasoning and other flavours so that it makes it more palatable. But of course if it was a survival food, then you'd literally be cooking it up as best way you could. Whether it was sort of roasting, withering the leaves on some flames like you would do nettles, that sort of thing. But of course sort of making it indoors just makes it more convenient to see the actual process, and then all it is really, it's just simply transferring those principles to the outdoors and applying those cooking processes and the ingredients. So I hope you found the video informative with the ingredients and just basically sort of food for free really. So until the next time, thanks for watching, really appreciate your interest and catch you in another video soon. Cheers, take care.